I'm with Robert Kiyosaki, the man who many years ago introduced many people around the world to a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I've had the privilege of engaging with Robert a few times on radio, but this is the first time on television.
Thank
Robert,
you for that.
Thank you for being here with us in South Africa. You're a regular visitor to the country.
Oh, I love South Africa. I love Africa, but I love South Africa even more. It's great.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad, just an update, how many copies have now been sold?
Well, there's legally printed and bootlegged, so probably about 50 million.
Incredible.
Yeah, okay.
I like the book, but this new book, Second Chance, I'm just actually going to show it to the camera, is extraordinary. You've gone deep, you've gone into your own feeling, your own spiritual ideas, and you say it all started, this book started in 1967 when you went to the man who you dedicated the book to, Dr. R. Buckminster Fuller, who's apart, I suppose, from your rich dad and your poor dad, is your hero.
Right. Dr. Fuller is considered one of the world's greatest geniuses. You know, he went to Harvard twice, was thrown out twice. AIA, American Institute of Architects, considered one of the greatest architects. He designed the geodesic dome. So in 1967, I was schooled in New York, and I hitchhiked from New York to Montreal, Canada, to see the geodesic dome and the man who could see the future. And that I just saw the dome, but I was fascinated by Fuller. And then in 1981, then I saw him on stage several times. I was a little guy in the audience. And then in 1981 in Kirkwood, California, which is just outside of Lake Tahoe, I had the chance to spend a week with him. And that week with him changed my life.
How?
Well, up until 1981, I was what you would call a greedy capitalist. You know, hardcore, just make money, screw everybody and all this. And then after Fuller, I realized there was a higher calling to just making money. And that really put me in a tailspin because my fundamental beliefs about money and why I was an entrepreneur changed. Mm. And I realized I had better start working for everybody, not just myself. And that was a change.
What did he believe? Maybe you can encapsulate, because reading through this book, you talk about Fuller's belief that there is an experiment that God is making on earth with mankind.
Well, Fuller always said that, and he wasn't really religious, but when he spoke of God, he liked what the American Indian called the Great Spirit that binds all of us. You know, we can feel it or not feel it. And he basically believed that God wanted to find out if human beings were going to choose heaven on earth or kill ourselves. That was the choice. And that's what he was best known for. So then he had these things called generalized principles. And a generalized principle is a principle that's true in all cases. So I set out to study the generalized principles he talked about, but I only got to 5. And out of those 5 principles, I made millions of dollars without having to screw people. You know, so it was a whole nother mind shift, a higher mind shift, a more spiritual mind shift than just making money for myself.
And that kicked you into writing
Yes.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yes. Fuller was a futurist, and he made predictions, like he died in 1983, on July 1st, 1983, but he predicted before the end of the decade, before 1990, there would be a new technology that would change the world. And as we know, in 1989, ARPANET became the internet, and the internet has now changed the world. So he has made about 250 predictions, and most have come true. Some are still yet to come true. So that's what he was known for.
Mm. But it was interesting that book that has changed so many people's lives, that is, as you say, bootlegged and non-bootlegged, sold 50 million copies, was a result of what you learned from Bucky Fuller.
Well, it was a combination of Bucky Fuller and my rich dad, because they were basically saying the same things. My rich dad was an uneducated man, but a hardcore capitalist. And Bucky was highly educated, but a hardcore socialist. But they had big hearts. You know, they weren't mean people. So reading Bucky Fuller and studying with him and studying with my rich dad, I realized that both were saying the same thing, and that was that we're being ripped off financially. That the world is set up to make us poorer, not richer.
You go very deep and actually have some fairly controversial opinions on this book, Grunch. and you refer to it a lot in your book. Encapsulate for us.
Well, he died on July 1st, 1983, and then a few months later, posthumously, Grunch of Giants was published. And Grunch stands for Gross Universal Cash Heist. In other words, we're being ripped off by the very thing we work for, is money.
Gross Universal Cash
Heist.
Heist. That sounds like people driving into a bank and stealing money, and stealing
Yes.
our money.
That's exactly what he was saying. It was exactly what my rich dad was saying. So when I read Grunch of Giants, and it was his first book, was Fuller's first book on the economy. All of his books are math and science and design and architecture and very heady stuff. But when I read Grunch of Giants, both Rich Dad and Poor Dad, both my Rich Dad and Bucky Fuller made sense. And that's why, if you read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, my rich dad said, never work for money. And Bucky was saying that's how our wealth is stolen, is via our monetary system. So, and which set up my campaign in Rich Dad, Poor Dad to basically dumb down, to make what Fuller, who is hard to read, as you know,
Indeed.
and Rich Dad hard to understand, simple enough for average people like me to understand. So Rich Dad, Poor Dad is a compilation of both Fuller and my Rich Dad, made simple enough so the average person could understand what our schools don't teach us about money.
That was the genius of it. Like Steve Jobs always said, things are very complex, but if you can hone it down to make it simple that people can understand. And clearly with Rich Dad, Poor Dad, you
made it simple.
And what was the overriding thrust of the message in the book, looking back at it now?
Well, it goes simply that money has a vocabulary. As we learn to speak, Kosa or English or Japanese. Well, money has its own language. So if you understand the vocabulary of money, words make you richer. Words become flesh, as they say in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So by teaching people the proper definition of each word, like income, expense, asset, liability, and cash flow, which are the 6 basic words of money. If you understand income, expense, asset, liability, and cash flow, you can control your life financially.
And if you don't understand money, as you say, people who are uneducated financially do not ask tough questions.
Right.
We see that all over the world.
Right. Well, people call their house an asset, but if you could read a financial statement, you'll see most people's houses are liabilities.
Because they
because
grab your cash.
It's real simple. Assets put money in your pocket, and liabilities take money from your pocket. So you have your nice BMW, you might call it an asset, but your banker calls it a liability. But they're happy because you're making monthly payments on it.
Just before we go into your views of where we're going into the future, you also look at how the banking system has affected or changed the structure, enslaved in many ways.
Yes.
is the way. In fact, that's the way you put it.
Yes, and I'm not against the banking system, nor am I against the stock market. I love the JSE. I thought about listing here at one time, but Toronto Stock Exchange offered me a better deal. What I'm against is a lack of financial education. We all are interested in money, so why don't we teach money at school? That has been my complaint forever.
Why don't we? I know you have some pretty strong views in the book.
Right.
Tell us why you don't think that financial education is passed on in schools.
Well, my research found that back in 1903, a man named John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie and those guys took over the academic systems of the world. And that's why they created in 1903 a thing called the General Education Board. And they determine what you learn in school. And that's why there's no financial education in school. I remember raising my hand going, hey, I was 9 years old. I said, when am I going to learn about money? The teacher says, we don't teach you about money in school. I said, well, why am I in school?
It's an extraordinary, and many people will think that, come on, that's a conspiracy theory that Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc. But it is extraordinary that there is no financial education in school.
The purpose of education, the current education throughout the world, actually comes from Prussia, the German system. And the purpose of the Prussian system of education was to create employees and soldiers, people who would do what they're told but not think.
All right, so looking at this book, it is thought-provoking, if nothing else. In fact, it's lots of things.
Yes.
But it also is pretty out there, because Clay Christensen, who's the greatest business thinker in the world, is very open with his faith. this is only the second time that I've seen somebody of the same kind of position talking about their faith in the way that he does and you do here.
Yes.
So what is it that drives you? You talk about there are certain rules that God gave man so that man could pass this great experiment that Bucky Fuller talks about.
Right. And again, I'm not real religious, but I'm very spiritual. I spent 2 years in Vietnam, and I saw what I call dead men kept fighting, so I knew there had to be something, I believe we're all here for a purpose. And when we find our purpose, you become self-actualized, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I didn't really realize that my purpose was to teach, because I hated school. And then one day I studied Fuller, and I went, oh my God, I have to start teaching. And that was probably on the totem pole of list, teaching, last position, And now I'm an entrepreneur in education. But it was like, oh my God, that's what I'm supposed to do. I didn't know that. I was just making money for me rather than telling people what I know. So that's when I started to write.
And your life changed when you were 50 years old, on your 50th birthday.
Yes.
You took a chance, wrote your own book, published it yourself. No one was interested initially.
Yes.
But my goodness, the public were.
Yes, I remember people telling me, you should stick to your old job. And I never expected Rich Dad, Poor Dad to take off. At first I created the cash flow game, which is how I learned about money. I played Monopoly with Rich Dad for years. So cash flow is the only game that's a step above Monopoly. And then I couldn't sell the game, so then being a marketing guy, I wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad out of desperation. And then that book didn't sell either. And then it took off one year. Oprah called me 3 years later or 2 years later. I went on the Oprah show, and suddenly I went from nobody knew me to infamous. A legend in my own mind. But that's the power of faith, That's the power of spirit.
Yeah. You do have people, pundits, saying it's simplistic. You don't know what you're talking about. How can you call a house not an asset? And I'm sure Second Chance will have the similar kind of criticism.
Oh, absolutely. If you're not saying something, you're never criticized. My friend Donald Trump right now is in a lot of hot water. He's saying things he shouldn't say, I don't agree with. But that's the chance you take when you come on like your programs and all this. You will always be criticized. So.
We're talking with Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, one of the greatest selling financial books of all time. He's also just written Second Chance, which is a lot deeper. If you thought that Rich Dad, Poor Dad was deep, well, wait until you get onto this one. We'll be talking after the break about the way he sees the future of the world. We're with Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the 50 million bestseller, who's recently published a new book called Second Chance. Robert, there's a lot of work that's gone into this. There's also some fairly controversial issues. You mentioned before the break your friend Donald Trump. He's talking along similar lines. And I'm not talking about the controversial stuff, but his economic issues are very similar to what you explore here.
Yes, and I want to say publicly, I don't agree with what he said about Mexicans. He was talking about illegal Mexicans. It's the same immigration problem you guys have. People are rushing into this country and they're desperate. And so to call Mexicans, rapists and gangsters and all this stuff, they're just desperate people. And it's part of the same symptom, the same as South Africa is flooded with people from Zimbabwe and other parts of the world.
Perhaps he just let his mouth run off with him a little there, because I read the context and anyway, the media will pick it up.
He's not well handled, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
We've all said things we shouldn't have said. He's saying a lot of them.
But on economics, it's hard to fault him.
I know.
It's hard to fault him.
But
and in the same way, it's hard to fault you.
Yeah, we do agree economically. So.
Well, let's just start off with the whole quantitative easing story and the consequences thereof. I go to the World Economic Forum every year in January to Davos. No one there knows what the consequence of QE is going to be. You've got some thoughts.
Oh, yes, they do. That's the whole thing. So there's 3 books. Of course, my book. But this is a fantastic book. It's written by a South African, Philip Haslam. It's When Money Destroys Nations. And it is about the collapse of Zimbabwe and the continuing collapse of it. And then there's this book by another South African, R.W. Johnson, is How Long Will South Africa Survive?
That has been a bestseller here.
It is, these guys are brilliant. I mean, not that mine's not brilliant, but these guys are brilliant, you know, they're fantastic. So the beauty of it, as Philip says in this book, is that South Africa has an opportunity to just study what happened next door to them in Zimbabwe, and you will see what quantitative easing does across the world. So basically what the three books are saying, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and my book, is that this is going on worldwide. And when quantitative easing comes in printing money, then what happens is the gap between the rich and everyone else goes wider, but also corruption gets bigger. And so I know you guys are having trouble with ESCOM and all that, but America has the same thing. You know, Detroit collapsed because our public sector unions started, the teachers, the firefighters, and the police started taking too much money. And so did the labor unions. So Detroit collapsed, Stockton collapsed, and Alameda collapsed. Chicago is next. So the same thing that's going on when I come to South Africa, and I love South Africa, it breaks my heart to see our systems breaking down, but I've already seen it in the States.
It's just mirroring issues that happen elsewhere.
Yes. And that's why Fuller wrote the book, Gross Universal Cash Heist, Grunch of Giants. And it's how the guys who operate the World Bank and the IMF operate. I'm not saying they're bad people, do you know what I mean? They have their agenda, you have your agenda, I have my agenda. Again, my agenda is why don't we teach this in school?
You said, and I want to get back to that, that people who are uneducated financially do not ask the tough questions. They don't ask the questions because they don't understand?
That's correct. Do you know, back when I was a kid in the 60s, I was taught to work hard and save money and invest for the long term in the stock market. So let's look at the stats. In 1970, if I put $1 million in a US bank, they paid me 15% interest. So $1 million at 15% would be $150,000 back in 1970. Now $150,000 was a lot of money back in 1970. So today, if I put $1 million in the bank, you know, some 40, 50 years later, I put $1 million in the bank, I'm lucky if I get 2%. So 2% on $1 million is $20,000. If I am a pensioner attempting to live on $20,000 a year, I'm now below the poverty line. That's how worthless money has become. And that's why my rich dad said savers were losers and don't invest for the long term in the stock market. You know, it's crazy. Stock market's at an all-time high. It's what, 18,000 on the Dow? Plus you have HFT, high frequency trading. You know, that book Flash Boys about the guys who front run the trades and all this. And the average person is sitting there working hard, paying more in taxes, saving money, and investing for their future in the stock market.
But the stock market, and that's, I think, somewhere where we will disagree. It is an investment in human initiative. It's an investment in the right, when you invest in the right companies that can change the world for good. But not all of them, I guess, and that's your point, not all of them do.
Well, if you read Second Chance, the stock market is rigged also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, back
How?
in 87, when we had the 87 stock market crash, it wasn't much. You know, 2000 was much bigger. But President Reagan put in what's called the President's Working Committee on the Markets. That meant the Fed could pump money into the stock market to keep it up. Mm. So it's manipulated. That's all I'm saying. So
the Chinese are doing that at the moment with
everybody's
the collapse
doing
in Shanghai.
That's what this book is saying. Yeah. It's not anything different.
So how do we take your teachings and apply them to ourselves to make sure that we are not victims and we are part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
Use exactly the words I would use. What Fuller says, we're supposed to be architects of the future, not its victims. That's one of the final quotes in this book. So the second chance is in three parts: past, present, and future. And the reason I recommend part 3, which is the future, is financial education, because what you'll find is everything they teach in school, it is opposite to what my rich dad taught me. I don't save money. Why would I save money when they're printing money? Why would I save money when they're giving me, you know, at best 2%? Why would I invest for the long term when there's front-running, high-frequency trading and all this, you know? Why would I get a job when people pay the highest taxes are jobs, people with employees? So everything is the opposite. So what happened, as I write about in Second Chance, is in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard. At that point, the US dollar became debt. So it makes it hard for people to understand, the people that are winning are people like me who understand debt. You see, debt is the name of the game today, not money. That's what this guy Philip is saying about Zimbabwe. The debtors are winning.
What do you, just talking about those 3 books again, R.W. Johnson's book, you have read it in South Africa?
I've read it. I love this
You read
book.
like I do. Lots of little points in it.
And I was talking to my wife about it this morning. It drives her nuts.
What do you make of it?
Brilliant writer. Well, he's footnoted. I mean, he backs everything he says up. It's saying the same thing I'm saying. It's the same thing Philip is saying.
So what do we do about avoiding, because he says 2 years to go for South Africa?
Well, that's why I'm saying everything's opposite. The name of the game today is debt. So what's happening to South Africa as well as happened to Zimbabwe was you couldn't pay back your debt. That's when the IMF steps in. Same things happened in Greece, in Venezuela. It's happening in Puerto Rico right now. Debt is killing us. But to survive, you must learn how to use debt. See, most people use debt to consume. New car, new house, new cell phone, new clothes, credit card debt. But I use debt to invest. Now that, most people say that's dangerous, and it is. But that's why financial education should teach you how to use debt to invest. I love
particularly
debt.
now, I guess, when interest rates are so low.
Oh, I just, when the market crashed in 2007, it hit a high in October 14th, 2007, and it went down, a crash is good. You see, I started to buy stuff at bargain basement prices, but I used debt to buy it.
You're concerned about the stock market, but there are times when it offers value?
Absolutely, and that's why I don't hate anybody. I love my banker, I love the JSE, I love the stock market. That's where I got my money from. I love my insurance company because they give me money because I can use debt. They want debtors. See, that's the difference, is the opposite in thinking. I don't save money, I use debt.
You're nearly 70 years old now.
Yeah.
It's a long life, and it's a life that when you turned 50 changed in went in a different direction.
Yes.
If you were to look back on that life and share with us what you've learned in that time, what would it be?
What's what Bucky Fuller said? You must trust your intuition. And it's called your gut feeling a lot of the times. And scientists have just recently found out there's actually brain material in your gut. That's why you get a bad feeling. And that's kind of where intuition comes from. It's more from your gut rather than your brain. And my intuition kind of changed because I went to Vietnam twice. I was a good U.S. Marine pilot and all this. I was doing it for God, country, and America, all this stuff. And one day I was standing on the battlefield in 1972 and I said, what am I doing here? Why am I killing these people? I don't hate them, they don't hate me. And that's when my life, you start waking up as you grow older. So I learned to trust my intuition and say what I had to say. Like this book is about the future also. Fuller was a futurist. So for me to write Rich Dad, Poor Dad in 1997, nearly 20 years ago, was about the future. It wasn't about 1997.
Are you optimistic about the future?
Well, as I said, I'm a capitalist. Markets go up, I make money. Markets go down, I make money. So why shouldn't I be optimistic?
But the essence here is this grand experiment that God is having with mankind. Are you optimistic that mankind, there's still more good than bad?
Well, I'll just repeat what Fuller said to me. I saw him 2 weeks before he passed away, and he said it's going to be touch and go. He says, God wants to know if we're going to go with our hearts. Are we going to lead with our hearts and make a world better for everybody? And so with that, I'm optimistic. And I see a lot of change. Like this guy, Elon Musk, he's the greatest entrepreneur in the world. He's a South African. Well, why is he in the States? He should be here. But they have geniuses like him, but guys like him are changing the world for the better, So I am optimistic. The concern is the other side who doesn't want it to change. So I'm very optimistic, but as Bucky says, it's touch and go right now.
So if you understand how the financial world works, if you can get a grasp on these things, you can ask the questions of the elites, of the bad guys, of the 1% who certainly aren't your friends.
Yeah, there are people who are definitely rich by being greedy, as you know. But so are the many poor people rich by being greedy. Like I said, Detroit went down, Stockton went down. In Phoenix, Arizona today, a police officer, this is the Public Service Union, 2 days before he graduates, he gets $1 million US bonus. That's a lot of money. Plus, he gets $185,000 for life. Now, it's good for the police officer, they do good work, but it's bankrupting Phoenix. Same as firefighters, same as school teachers. Same thing going on here.
Robert Kiyosaki, as always, a great privilege. The author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and Second Chance for Your Money, Your Life, and Our World. It'll open your eyes, and it'll open your thoughts to areas that you didn't even conceive were there before. Thank you.
Thank you.